This is the commercialization session,
Yeah.
and we have three co-moderators. I want to throw the mic to as quickly as I possibly can. The tiles are in a certain order. They may not be on yours, but I see Joe Cook Jr. He is formerly the CEO and chairman of the board of Amylin. And before that, he was Group Vice President, Global Operations at Eli Lilly, and many, many other things. But that should give you a good enough reason to, or information to know why he is on the panel here. We see Dennis Purcell up there. He is the founder of Aisling Capital. And I embarrass him by saying that he's basically financed a quarter of the biotech sector as a long-term banker and funder. We have Ed Saltzman. He's wearing the banner of Lumanity, I believe, the head of biotech strategy for that. But Ed founded Defined Health, which is a well-respected consulting firm in business development and commercialization, commercial assessment, and so forth, that a very long-time observer of the pharma space. So let me throw it over to the three gentlemen here, and I'll fade away.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Oh, I should introduce you.
Everybody hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, so just because we actually haven't fully communicated with all of the panelists in terms of the order, just to reassure you, the moderators are certainly sure of the order. And what we're going to do is I'm going to just introduce. We're going to kind of divide into silos, at least initially, just for the purposes of introduction. But I want to be careful that we don't stay in those silos. So the biotech people can jump into the pharma space. The pharma space people can jump into the nutrition space. Let's just cross that. So the only real structure for this 2+ hour free-for-all, where the biggest challenge is keeping people's interest for it. I don't even want to think about that. But it's going to be essentially, a kind of an open discussion, like a free-for-all, as I think we need, to really get this all out, and we'll digest, and in the end, maybe one of us, hopefully it's not just me, will volunteer to do a so what. So we've got some key takeaways. But what we did just in terms of structure to get us started is I said I'd make a couple of opening remarks for a minute or two. Then I will ask the pharma panelists to introduce themselves. And Mike, I'm going to group you into because I know you kind of wear two hats, firewall being what it is, but it says Pfizer and venture. So I'm going to ask you to speak to the venture side. So we'll introduce you as part of the venture group or the investor group. And then the larger food nutrition companies and space will go there. So I'm going to.
And is Joan part of the biotech group? Is that
Joan will be part of the biotech group? Yeah. If I haven't, I'm not missing anybody. I certainly don't mean to miss anybody. I see everybody on my screen. But yes, you can probably. But if anybody wants to self-identify in another group, go right ahead. I note for the past decade, pharma companies have been referring to themselves as biotech companies. So I'm not sure.
It's because the multiples are higher
these days. Okay.
Well, it was because the multiples were higher. So
exactly, Joe. So that will be our order, just to get everybody. And then when you get called on to introduce, if you could for just a minute or two, just explain who you are, what you're doing, where you've been. I know bios are in the programs that are handed out, so you don't have to go through your whole LinkedIn page. But really, most importantly, just state why you're interested in this topic, okay? And then we'll take it from there, all right? We'll get everybody involved, and hopefully we'll have a vigorous and really informative discussion. So I want to also thank the organizers here, because I realized just sitting in on one of these panels, and they're doing this for 4 days with that energy level being incredibly high, just extraordinary. So I want to thank them for pulling everything together, particularly Thomas and Georgiana, the team at Catalyst. Congratulations. It's a great meeting. I will tell you, I have the authority to say it's a great meeting because I've been to all of them. I was on the program at the first one in the what seems like the ancient year of 2017, and so it's been a convenient 5 years. So I think we've got a kind of a 5-year point as we think about the discussion, and I'll come back to this. I'm not going to develop this now, But to think about where the field has been in the last 5 years and where we think it's going to go in the next 5 years. I don't think anybody would argue, at least people who were there in London in 2017, would argue that this field has moved way beyond where we were when this meeting first convened. The science has advanced, the clinical translation has advanced. I'm afraid much of the regulatory framework that we need in regulatory innovation may be a little bit lagging, but we can talk about that. We've seen clinical progress. We've also seen some clinical disappointment. That's just the nature of this game. We've seen clinical de-risking of some programs. We've seen a lot more novelty coming into the space and a lot more novel approaches. One thing we haven't seen is, perhaps it's too early, is a really deep conversation around how this is all going to get paid for, at least the part that is professionally determined as opposed to consumer determined. And we'll have to think through those two big buckets. But again, I would encourage people not to particularly get siloed. So with that, I think what I'm going to do is just turn to the conversation very, very quickly and turn to the introductions. But what I really want to see is I want to see that we look back on this and we say, wow, we've made progress. We still have an enormous number of issues in front of us, but we're going to stay high level in the discussion. And hopefully we'll work it down. So, we jotted down, and Dennis was very helpful in this regard, just a couple of big buckets that we'll talk about. Like, who's going to pay for all this, right? Who's going to fund it? Who's going to fund innovation? Where's that innovation going to come from? When will the large companies buy into the evolving science here? Okay. Maybe some of them already have. Can we develop a healthy longevity commercial model within the existing pharma consumer business model? Do we need another one? All right. And I hope we'll get a little bit of time, especially because we have Kevin from Lilly here to talk a little bit about obesity, because I think that obesity is first and foremost one of the greatest barriers to achievement of a long, healthy lifespan. And so we'll talk about that. And I hope we'll also get to intersect a little bit about where we are in terms of chronic disease. So before I hand it off, the last comment I would make is simply that here's the biggest change I've seen. And I say this looking particularly at the pharma people I'm about to turn to. There is a lot more interest in pharma over the course of the last year. The pendulum has started to swing away from what was frankly an obsession with oncology and rare disease, as well as advanced therapies such as gene and cell therapy. Not that those are going away and not that they shouldn't, but a rediscovery of chronic disease and the value of treating chronic disease and intervening early in chronic disease processes. And so we're seeing a lot of interest across the pharma space, not per se in longevity, but in obesity, in metabolics, in chronic kidney disease, in heart disease. Some of this probably, and I know there was a panel on this, Dr. Hazeltine discussed that comes out of COVID, but I think these are fundamental trends, and I think they relate to the commercial opportunity as well. So let's start there. I'm going to ask Kevin to go first, introducing yourself, and then I will go to, I'm missing some people on my screen. But why don't I just ask the pharma representatives to introduce themselves? So Kevin, I'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Kevin Duffin. I'm Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, and Head of Core Technologies of the Diabetes, Obesity, and Complications organization at Eli Lilly. I've been probably in the last few years especially involved in the discovery and development of tirzepatide, which is now known as Mounjaro. So I'm very familiar with the obesity space related to that, and very interested to hear the conversation today.
Great. I'm looking around.
Hi, I can help you out, Ed. This is Morris.
Hey, Morris. That's it.
Yeah, so my name is Morris Birnbaum. I guess I spent most of my life as an academic, running an academic lab at a number of different institutions. But I'm probably here because I spent 8 years at Pfizer, where I was senior vice president and chief scientific officer of what at Pfizer was called the Internal Medicine Research Unit, which was a group that was responsible for discovery through proof of concept or phase 2A of common chronic disease, including metabolic disease. And the type of indications we worked on were and continue to be obesity, diabetes, heart disease. I left Pfizer about June or last year, so now I'm actually in biotech. So I'm on that transitional course that puts me in both groups. I spend most of my time in pharma, and I guess that's what I'm here to talk about. I will say that my interest in terms of what we're talking about today is really being very distressed at the how the pendulum over the last 5 or 10 years or 20 years has really swung away from large pharma and investors. And I think that's important. It's not just large pharma, it's also a lot of the investment community not being willing to put time and money and resources into chronic common disease. To me, it really becomes semantic, whether we're talking about diseases of aging or longevity or chronic diseases. And again, for me, my own bias is we're also talking about synonymous with diseases of metabolism, metabolic diseases, which I think are responsible for the vast majority, as I think probably most people here would agree with, the vast majority of chronic diseases of aging. So maybe the pendulum has begun swinging back. I'd like to be more optimistic than I am. And what I fear, and we'll talk more about that, is what looks like a resurgence of interest in chronic disease is really limited to a couple of mechanisms. Kevin cited probably the most successful one of the recent years, which is the GLP family and some of the innovations that Lilly has brought to that. But I hope that's not the extent of it, and it's really brought of that. But anyway, I'm a retired Pfizer person. I'm interested in chronic disease, and I'm very concerned about the willingness of large pharmaceutical companies and investors to invest in this area.
Thanks, Morris. That's great. We'll segue, and I'll hand it to Joe, who will introduce the biotech participants.
So the biotech participants that I see include Joan, right?
Yes.
So Joan leading Tornado Therapeutics. I'll let her explain it, but this is an exciting area of science, and she's got a uniquely interesting perspective to bring.
Yes. So Joan Manick, I actually started in 2010 at Novartis, building their program to target aging biology as a new way to treat aging-related diseases, and we focused on the aging immune system. And when I started this program, people really didn't understand how big a problem the aging immune system was. And I used to go to investors and talk about, hey, viral respiratory tract infections are really a big problem, and they would like fall asleep. And then COVID happened. So it has really shifted the landscape, including the views of the FDA. When we started a phase 3 program in 2017, the FDA would not let us use nasopharyngeal swabs as part of our endpoint for respiratory tract infections, because they said no one in the real world gets a nasopharyngeal swab when they have a respiratory tract infection. Yeah, that was a really problem when you can't use a nasopharyngeal swab to diagnose viral respiratory tract infections, and that has completely shifted. So I think this is a really exciting area, not just for Tornado Therapeutics, which is moving ahead in this area, but for a lot of different companies that are targeting aging biology.
So I might comment as a former biotech. And by the way, Maury, I graduated from Lilly into biotech, and the world is okay on both sides of that fence. When we were first developing GLP-1, which was exenatide, it was clear to us that this agent had a profound impact on a number of metabolic signals as well as just general health. And as a biotech company, one of the strategies you have to do is you have to figure out how to focus on something that actually can produce enough excitement that people will put money into a crazy idea with a high rate of failure. So the idea of funding a long-term health span model without a clear endpoint at a biotech level is a very interesting thing for us to talk about today. So at some point when we jump into the biotech, I'll maybe offer a few more opportunities about how perilous biotech existence is without the clarity. And I don't see, do I see any other biotech participants yet? Oh, yeah. Mark, sorry. My screen is not, I have to scroll to get my full screen. There, Mark. All right, Mark Nuttall.
Good morning. Thanks very much, Joe. And thanks for giving us the opportunity to present Cambrian Biopharm today. So Cambrian Biopharm is a biotech company based in New York. We've had 2 successful rounds of funding. We're focused on longevity. In particular, we're focused on health span, increasing health span, of course. We have a very interesting model. It's a hub and spoke model, and we can talk more about that, I think, when we get in depth into the biotech section. We have a nice mix, I think, of programs that have the most evidence in longevity so far, but also some very innovative programs in longevity as well. And so I can elaborate. I head up business development, also head up the ventures group, which is around new company formation. Excited to be part of this panel.
Great.
Yeah, Joe, I think we were going to loop me into the biotech.
Yeah, with the big Pfizer logo there, I was having a little.
We're putting you in investors, Mike, whether you like it or not.
Pfizer Ventures, right?
There we go.
Yeah,
all right, Mike.
I certainly kind of bridge both worlds. I've been at Pfizer for a long time, 14 years, on both the R&D side and a very short stint on the commercial side in managed markets. So I think we'll be getting into how we're going to pay for this later on.
Yeah.
So I can add some perspective there as well. But the day job with Pfizer Ventures, right, certainly is mainly external facing. So I spend way more time in the biotech community and with biotech investors than I do necessarily inside Pfizer these days. And so Pfizer Ventures is a corporate venture fund, but we invest in syndicate with, the traditional biotech investors that invest in therapeutics, not necessarily so much focused on longevity. And so what brings me here today is interesting. Actually, I was flipping through some of the materials Thomas shared from last year's talk. Somewhere in there was like a transcript, I guess, of this panel from last year. And either Ed or Dennis said something like, I guess we've been talking about the pendulum already today, but they were talking about whoever made this statement said something like innovation is shifting away from business model orientation to biology. Right, there's a lot of good science now, and at Pfizer, I mean, we have a saying that we're in this scientific renaissance. So yes, there's a lot of good science happening, and I think there's a lot of capital flowing into the biotech space because of that. But actually, what brings me here is business innovation, and so I don't think Sebastian made it here today. Sebastian from VitaDAO. But we've made we're in the process of making a small investment in VitaDAO, which is a longevity-focused accelerator model, which we can talk more about. And I think I'll be interested to hear more of Mark's comments from Cambrian, because I think they also are kind of pioneering this transition that traditional venture capital needs to make towards financing longevity. And we'll get into that in a lot more detail. I certainly have some thoughts. But that's what brings me here today is actually I was more interested in this unique business model that VitaDAO operates under. They happen to focus on longevity. Pfizer's interest in longevity is starting to tick up. And so, it's good to get involved early, but I'm really just learning that, who the players are. It's a totally different investor set than I interact with, on a daily basis. So it's good learning.
Well, you're gonna play importantly as we get into the conversation of how are we going to fund and who is going to fund all this, because it really is it is going to take a different model from several dimensions. One, the concept of what it is we're trying to do, and two, how we're going to get the economics. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, Dennis.
Sure. Let's move to the food and nutrition panelists. Maybe Antonio, you want to start off?
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. Antonio Tatrani here. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at PepsiCo. I also have a couple of other roles. One very important one is I'm the head of a department in R&D, which is called Life Sciences. And I also oversee our fellows program. By the way of a description of my professional journey, I started as a physician scientist in the intramural research program at the NIH and NIDDK down in Phoenix, Arizona, trying with a very valiant and very intelligent group of people to identify the biological and eventually even genetic causes of chronic metabolic diseases, with a partnership, long-standing partnership with the Pima Indians of Arizona. And so all of the diseases that fall under the umbrella of this discussion, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular, dyslipidemia, hypertension, you name it. And eventually made perhaps the obvious transition into the pharma industry, where I tried to contribute to the development of drugs for many of those diseases, first with Merck, dyslipidemias, and then with Sanofi for over a decade, again, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular, a whole bunch of other diseases. And then eventually I probably made the best decision of my professional life and transitioned to the food and beverage industry for a whole host of reasons, including some that I think we will discuss today. The most important of which is that to solve the problem that we're discussing at scale, I now profoundly believe that that is going to require low-tech, low-cost solutions, and food and beverages fall in that category.
Yes.
Thanks, Antonio. And I see that Stephen Gow has joined us, Stephen from Novo. So Stephen, if you don't mind, just, I know you missed the original introduction, just introduce yourself briefly. We don't need the whole bio, and tell us your interest in the space and why you've agreed to do this. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
So I'm really sorry I had technical difficulties with the login details. So I'm sorry I'm a little bit late, but I'm Stephen Goff. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Novo Nordisk. I'm based in Copenhagen, Denmark, and also head of medical affairs. My interest in this area clearly relates to sort of our cardiometabolic franchise, and specifically GLP-1 receptor agonists, which we developed for diabetes and then obesity. And also identified, along with other companies, that there's a beneficial effect in terms of cardiovascular disease, other diseases like potentially chronic kidney disease, and also neurodegeneration. And so our investment in this area, which really is, I think, sort of ties into extending a healthy lifespan, is that with agents like GLP-1 receptor agonists, we see an opportunity to reduce the onset and the development, the risk of diseases that occur later on in life. Diseases, if you like, associated with aging. So although we don't specifically have an aging program or a program specifically aimed at trying to extend healthy lifespan, I think that's part of what happens and what is happening as we develop GLP-1 receptor agonists for additional indications. And we're conducting large outcome trials, trials up to 17,500 people in terms of neurodegeneration, so that we can actually meet existing regulatory requirements. And we're also working with the regulators to try and change things, but currently we're working to existing regulatory guidelines so that we can get indications for these individual conditions. So I hope that provides a bit of background to my interest in this area.
It does. Thank you so much, Stephen. And glad you were able to join us.
Great.
Okay.
Catherine, maybe we can go over to you.
Sounds great. So good morning, everyone. Catherine Quick-Uribe. I'm part of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs for Mars Edge. Mars Edge is a segment within Mars Incorporated that you may be aware of great treats that we make, both for pets and for people. You may be less familiar with the research that we've done in the context of health. And so perhaps I will echo some of Antonio's comments in the context of trained scientists. And when I had an opportunity to think about my next step in my career, coming into a food and beverage company was the choice I made, because I felt the ability to really translate nutrition and health into something that people could do every day. We all eat and enjoy food in many different ways every day. And, food companies and beverage companies have the opportunity to do that. What may be surprising to a number of you is the fact that Mars Incorporated, largest privately held food company, still does quite a bit of human research. The research program that I've managed now for many years is the longest ongoing research program within Mars's history. It is the human research program focused on the bioactives in cocoa. And hopefully today, as we talk a little bit about models and approaches, I'll share some of that information, but it is recently completed the trials called Cosmos, which looked at a cocoa supplement and a multivitamin outcome study, which involved over 21,000 people over a 5-year period, and actually looked at really hard endpoints. And once again, in the field of nutrition, this is new, very different from what happens in pharma, but we looked at a number of cardiovascular outcomes, morbidity, mortality, as well as cancer. So, it is really an exciting time to really look, I think, at nutrition and how do we take these findings and ultimately translate them into things that consumers can do today for their health as a complement to everything else they need to do. So excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And just to show everyone how we might not be as siloed as we may think, Catherine, I'm glad you brought up the Cosmos study. I did get to look at it before when Thomas was kind enough to circulate the slides. I didn't know if you were going to be sharing the slides today, but you gave a very good overview of it. And I'll say this also to the pharma people that are on the call. If you haven't got to see it, it's really worth looking at, because particularly those of you who've been wrestling in the cardiometabolic area for a long time and know what those trials look like and know the size of those trials and the global nature of those trials, the endpoints, the reduction in mortality, all of those things, this looks exactly like a drug trial. Okay, in a lot of ways. I'm sure there are important ways, Catherine, that it's different, and maybe we can get into that later. But if you just looked at it quickly, it just looks like you've substituted a nutritional intervention or a food intervention for a pharmaceutical intervention. So we are not that far apart. Okay, where I think we are really far apart is that Mars may be a private company, but it's a gigantic private company, and it has a lot of capital. Its cost of capital arguably would be relatively lower than, say, Mark's cost of capital, right? Or anybody or Jones' cost of capital. So we are in similar spaces, but we're also kind of in different spaces. And that kind of gives me that first segue. So I'll start there, and then I'll get the other panelists to help jump in. And no Robert's rules here. Anybody who wants to jump in, please do. I have found in previous ones that the raise hand function is if that's working on here and you have an ability to raise the hand, please do. If you really want to get in a point, we'll try to recognize it. And I'll try to also, and I can ask my moderators as well, my co-moderators too, to look at the Q&A and make sure we're keeping up with the questions that are coming in from the audience. So let's start with that. I'm going to back up just one before I get into the who's going to fund, understanding that we have plenty of time, and just take a page from what Morris said earlier. Because I've been wondering, and the organizers know this because I'm a broken record on this, but those of you who haven't heard me say it, I think the real strategic issue and the strategic pillar in this entire field is how much focus do we put on preventing chronic disease versus how much focus do we do on looking at cellular mechanisms of aging. And where do those two things meet? Are they the same thing? Are they different? Are there different, buckets of science? So I'd love to start there, okay? Because I actually think they are a bit different, but I also think you don't get to the second one, or it may make no sense to come to the second one if we can more easily and more rapidly get more innovation in terms of preventing chronic disease and the manifestations of chronic disease, regardless of what they do to longevity biomarkers. All right, so let me start there. I'll call on you first, Morris, but I'll encourage everybody to shout, and I'll ask one more question. I'm going to turn it over to Joe and Dennis.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it's a a nice crystallization of one of the problems. And actually, what I would see right now, at least from my viewpoint of where I come from, what has become the, let's say, standard approach, but certainly the most accessible approach to these kind of problems, and melding the two areas of longevity, aging, and chronic disease. And I think where we stand right now is there are basically fundamentally two approaches to it. One of it is the one that the GLP companies and Novo and Lilly are really taking, where you have a really effective therapeutic for metabolic disease. So you explore in a vast array of indications for which there are some very compelling suggestive data that they're useful, and you try it there. That's one situation with GLP. But I think the other one is the one that you really refer to, and that is what you do is you take the biology of aging to identify your target, but then you use that target as a basis for conducting what would be a conventional study on chronic disease. So, you identify NAD metabolism, which is a very active area of aging, and where there's now been very good information, very good studies showing that it's important in longevity, but more specifically important in the kind of chronic diseases of longevity, like heart disease and renal disease. And of course, then what you do is you use the aging field to identify your classic drug target, but then you test it in a classic drug discovery approved regulatory pathway setting. To me, that's the most readily approachable route to combining the two, and I think there's a lot of activity going on now. Now, I have to say, certainly at the large company and anecdotally all across the board, a lot of those studies just aren't holding up. They're just not getting there, and there really seems to be right now a bit of trouble, or certainly a bit of lack of confidence in this whole concept of taking what's now becoming very standard aging targets and incorporating them into according to them what I would call standard endpoint clinical studies for those kind of diseases. So that's where that's where we were headed at Pfizer when I was there, was using the aging field to identify those targets, but running studies that are very standard kind of heart failure, renal failure, diabetes, obesity type studies.
Great. Thanks, Morris. Does anybody else want to comment on that before I turn it over to my other moderators?
Go ahead. There's some hands. Stephen, you want to go?
I was just going.
After asking for hands, now I didn't see them. I apologize. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yes, I was just going to add that I'm not saying science isn't part of what we do, but I think in terms of preventing chronic disease, this is a rapidly increasing area of interest for Big Pharma, and particularly those in the metabolic space. And I think even though we would like to say it's changed in the last 2 or 3 years, I think it's changed dramatically in the last 3 or 4 months. With the introduction of further agents that have significant impact on weight, and with the change in the sort of consensus statement or support from the consensus statement from the ADA and EASD in terms of prevention and the role of treating obesity to prevent diabetes and chronic disease, I think there's a big shift. And I know within Novo Nordisk, we talk a lot about prevention, and we've set up a number of activities internally where the focus is not so much now treating diabetes or treating obesity, but how do we prevent these chronic diseases? And I think it's really taking center stage for Big Pharma who's involved in these areas.
Joan, I see your hand up as well, and I'll go to Mark. And I'll go to Mike.
Yes. So I can talk a little bit about how we approach this at Novartis, and probably the best validated mechanism regulating aging biology in preclinical species is inhibition of mTOR. And so we had to say, okay, how do we move this into humans? We marketed an mTOR inhibitor for cancer indications and to suppress the immune system in organ transplant patients with doses that have a lot of side effects. And we knew you can't do that. You can't use these kind of doses if you want to treat aging, prevent aging related diseases. So we used very unusual dosing regimens. We tested them in healthy older adults, and we found the thing that happens is antiviral immunity gets upregulated as well as vaccination response. So we took that data and said, no, there isn't a regulatory path for improving the function of the aging immune system. We focus on, the aging liver, the aging heart, the aging brain. This is a new regulatory path, but it's probably a path that's worth, the risk of moving forward. And so we moved these compounds forward to do something interesting, which is preventing respiratory tract infections. And the reason it's interesting is respiratory tract infections occur at such a high rate that you don't need huge trials to show prevention. So it's unlike, MIs and cardiovascular events. In a relatively small trial compared to, MACE trials, you can show benefit. And we've had, a bumpy road because discussing with the FDA, who said, hey, this is new for us, we're going to have to learn with you. I don't think we've had the right endpoints, but as we've done these trials, we've learned a lot about what are probably the appropriate endpoints for trials of these agents to improve immune function. So I think it's an exciting area that sort of spans traditional endpoints and health span prevention.
Thanks, John. We go to Mark.
Yeah, great. So let me describe the Cambrian model. So we're targeting the hallmarks of aging, the different pathways to treat multimorbidity disease. But we also understand that these pathways will work in one or two. Each one of these pathways will work in one or two individual diseases. So our strategy is to have a stepping stone indication, right? So we prove the mechanism, the safety, in a stepping stone indication. That stepping stone indication is often cardiac, metabolic, a CNS indication. But what that allows us to do is first develop the molecule against that particular pathway in the particular hallmark of aging. And then we get a commercially viable indication, which makes investors happy in the near term. It also potentially attracts the likes of Pfizer in terms of partnering. And so in parallel, we develop that same molecule or a backup molecule or a second series in longevity. So we understand the pathway, we understand the safety around the pathway, and we can develop these two kind of indications, if you like, in parallel. So in this way, we have a near-term solution for a long-term problem. So this is how we're approaching it at Cambrian.
Great, thanks. And
Yeah. Oh, sorry. You're going to say something, Andrew?
No, I'm going to just give you the floor. Yeah.
No, I mean, this is great dialogue. I feel like everyone's comments are building on each other, right? So Maury is saying you have to use longevity as a way to identify targets to move into the clinic in the conventional path. And then Joan with the mTOR example is a nice way of showing what Mark called the stepping stone, right? You use the traditional path to step into longevity focused studies. And so I brought here some data, which is interesting. This is from the Longevity Technology 2021 report. And someone took a look at everything that was in the clinic for longevity companies in 2021. And they made this pie chart. I can't share my slides here, but basically they segmented by the hallmarks of longevity. So for those of us in the conventional world, we'll understand some of these terms, but it's not traditionally what we put molecules into the clinic around for the most part. So mitochondrial dysfunction, maybe a little bit, stem cell exhaustion, loss of proteostasis, telomere attrition, genomic instability, and senescence, okay? So that's how they mapped it. But now when you actually look at those studies and you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you look at how they're characterized, it is age-related macular degeneration, AMD, dementia, obesity, NASH, Parkinson's, SMA, right? Spinal muscular atrophy, sarcopenia. I could go on, but these are all, things that are very familiar in the traditional drug development world. So it's, who said it? Mark, the stepping stone approach may be the best path forward. So.
Great.
Yep.
So I'm going to turn it over to one of my other moderators, Dennis or Joe. You can jump in and decide to kick off this discussion as to, who's going to fund all this? I mean, we're going to start there. When we talk about all this, we talk about what we've just been talking about. We're talking about large randomized trials. We're talking about early drug discovery. We're talking about, all the work that's going to be necessary to get to a point. And Sebastian, I see you've joined. We'll come to you in 1 second. To get to where this ecosystem really is developed. So 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, who knows? We'll look back on that 2017 conference, the 2022 conference, and say, oh my goodness, we have a field, okay? But it's going to take a lot, and it's going to take a lot of brains, a lot of money, and a lot of work. So Joe, do you want to take that, or Dennis?
I start with one view, and I don't know, maybe it's useful, maybe it's not. I spent a good deal of my life focusing on developing human medicines, 28 years with Lilly, and Kevin's carrying that, continuing on. And then with Amylin, a number of others. And over the course of that, a lot of it's been focused on diabetes. And I remember when I started, the concept of time and range was not even a discussion topic, and neither was HbA1c. So until the seminal study that linked HbA1c to macular disease was established, we really didn't have an appropriate means of researching diabetes medicines, except in a very large, costly trial. I think the same thing is true now. If you think about the course of how we view diabetes today, it is far broader in its concept. The idea of treating pre-diabetes, I remember having a discussion at the FDA where we proposed that our first GLP-1 candidate might in fact delay the onset of diabetes. And the agency head at that time said, there is no disease that we treat called pre-diabetes. Well, welcome to the real world of trying to get funding for a disease that is not going to be recognized by the FDA. Since that time, thanks to work that both Novo and Lilly and others have done, I think that bar has been pushed considerably more open. Stephen, I think you guys actually got a pre-diabetes inclusion in one of your label updates. And I know Lilly's working on it now with the GLP-1 and both SGLT2 and GIP and all the other. The question has to be examined at a regulatory level. So my contribution here to this is I think we need to think about this as a long-term journey. I think it's going to involve a considerably larger amount of overlap between nutrition companies and drug companies, because that middle space of how people eat and live their lives that results in a defective condition, often, not always, some may be genetic predisposition, but a large portion of our aging process can be altered by the manner in which we conduct life. And I think it's appropriate for us to begin thinking about the definition of what is the end goal. I put forth a concept some time ago about what is the value of an enriched year of life, and how might we actually begin to articulate that. I don't want to necessarily live longer if what I'm going to live is in a condition of unenriched existence. So articulating a concept that might influence both the regulatory process, the legislative process, and so forth, might begin, if we can frame that thoughtfully, I believe it would create an opportunity for the funding to come in a way that's maybe materially different than the past. And I'll throw it open for comments here.
Sebastian, do you want to, I know you joined us late, do you want to just, because you might want to comment on some of what Joe just said, but you also might just want one very quick, brief self-intro for everybody's purposes, and what interest you're bringing to this topic.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Sorry for the delay. I was double booked. So yeah, really cool conference. Excited to chat with you all. Nice to see some familiar faces on the panel. Who am I? I look myself in the mirror every day and ask that question. But for the purposes here, I'm a biomedical scientist by training. I've spent pretty much all of my career in the longevity space in the field of geroscience. First, doing biochemistry research and molecular neuroscience, and then I helped launch Apollo Health Ventures, which is today the largest aging-focused venture fund in the world, 200 million under management, led by Jens Eckstein from SR1. There, I launched a company called Samsara Therapeutics. This is today the largest autophagy-focused drug discovery company. I co-founded it with Guido Kromer, who is the senior author on the Hallmarks of Aging paper. And we have 4 new mechanism of action autophagy-enhancing small molecules approaching the clinic. And then I launched a company co-founded called Cambrian Biopharma. I see Mark Nuttall is on the call here. And you guys may know that's a large multi-asset, what we call DISCO, distributed drug discovery company, pursuing many of the hallmarks of aging. And then I co-founded a venture fund, HealthSpan Capital, investing in longevity and regenerative medicine, as well as my latest company, Immune Age Pharma, which is based on rejuvenating the immune system by targeting the hematopoietic stem cells and T cells and other immune cell types ex vivo. I'm just a simple scientist, so I can't really comment on, the regulatory regime and how that will evolve. But, I am optimistic based on HbA1c and LDL being surrogate prescribable biomarkers. And I think if we have some sort of composite biomarker of aging, whether it's a combination of methylation clocks and frailty and all other blood biomarkers, I think eventually we can get there. But the good thing is for the geroscience hypothesis to work, and I don't think we should call it a hypothesis anymore, as Matt Kaberlin has said, we should call it the geroscience paradigm, because the results are in. It really is true that you can slow aging and thereby slow most age-related diseases. So for the geroscience paradigm to benefit everybody, we don't need FDA to recognize aging as a disease or a prescribable condition. We just do label expansion and take down as many age-related diseases as we can in sequence or in parallel. So that whole debate about whether aging is a disease and what the regulators think, I think is immaterial. But the bigger question, and one that we contend with every day, is, what are the best lead indications, and what are the indications that FDA does recognize that a great number of old people do suffer from? Sarcopenia is one, although that's a difficult one to get approval, but maybe, metabolic syndrome or something else. So I, open it up to comments about what kind of lead indications would be the lowest hanging fruit that are also very common, that many people could be on this drug for a long period of time.
So. Thanks, Sebastian. And Catherine and Antonio, maybe you could comment on what we've just heard. I mean, is there an overlap here, or do you guys care about the prior conversation, or are you in a world totally different from what we've heard so far? I'm trying to figure out whether, at the end of the day, I think at the end here, maybe I'd like to have a little conversation about an ecosystem here. There's a real good ecosystem in the biotech world that's developed over time, and it's in place. And, I wonder whether there's going to be one that develops here. And I wonder whether, Catherine and Antonio, whether you guys have your own, Ed talked about silos. Is there any overlap, or is what you're doing totally different, or do you care about what anybody else said earlier?
Catherine, you had your hands up, so I'll let you go first.
Thank you. So I absolutely care about what was said earlier. I think just building on the idea, do I think there's a role for the food/supplement industry, pharma, as well as the technology space? I think there's going to be this, personal devices, which we've talked about in previous panels. It's the intersection of those things. As a company that provides a range of products to consumers are asking and wanting and looking for healthier options. But beyond that, they're actually also looking for things that, and I'm going to say these words, even though legally I'm barred from talking about these things, they're interested in foods that can help them manage and improve their health, manage and improve their sort of management of disease. If you're in the food and beverage and supplement space, these are words that we're forbidden from talking about, but we know consumers are looking for these things. I also think that in the context of the Cosmos trial, we had a very specific interest. We had done a number of studies over the past 20 years. They're going to seem minuscule in the pharma world, everything ranging from 10 to 200 people over the course of several months, looking at a range of surrogate biomarkers of cardiovascular health and cognitive function. But Cosmos gave us the opportunity to really look at something at a sort of unmatched scale, often in the field of nutrition. And so we took that as an opportunity. But we didn't just engage because we were interested in understanding what the role of the bioactives in cocoa, these flavonoid compounds, what their role could be in health, but also because there was a fundamental question. We're talking quite a bit today about aging and disease. Unfortunately, I think often in this space, we are, you're challenged with, how do you talk about health? Often it's often framed in the context of disease. What does your health look like? Well, what's your blood pressure look like? What does your insulin level look like? What does your lipid levels look like? One of the opportunities in the Cosmos trial, because we have over 21,000 people, mean duration for intervention was over nearly 4 years. You've got longitudinal samples, is to actually probe that data set and say, what are actually biomarkers of health? Not just what are biomarker, what is their disease trajectory? What is their aging trajectory? But could you actually now probe that data set and actually get unique and distinct clusters of biomarkers for health? And that was actually one of the drivers for our interest, because people are looking for ways to stay healthy. And in the food and supplement space, what are those markers and opportunities that you can actually give them to help them monitor that? And so, you know, I think there's definitely overlap and intersections, and we should be talking. And I think there's also, you know, greater need for, I think, partnerships to actually move together from a regulatory perspective as well, because if these things can work together and should complement each other, being able to talk in the same language, being able to express things in the same way would, I think, be a huge unlock.
Yes.
Right now, we've got these silos because there's a regulatory framework which actually prevents crosstalk. So
Antonio,
go ahead.
Antonio, just before you go, just a quick thing, Catherine and Antonio, what kind of partnerships do you see in the traditional biotech world now? It's partnerships all over the place with big pharma and smaller companies. That's accepted. From the food and nutrition world, do you see yourself doing partnerships? Do you see yourself starting a venture capital fund like Pfizer and Novo have? Do you see partnering up with people like Cambrian? How do you see? I
think we certainly do seeing as those as opportunity spaces for us, right? And I think part of it is making sure that sort of we can get to a sort of a common approach and both get sort of mutual benefit. Unfortunately, in some of these conversations, because there could be the opportunity to explore, but we would be barred in our category of operation from talking about it, that's a barrier to entry. So I think they're definitely interested in these cross-sector and collaborations, but it also has to be with this ability to have a regulatory unlocker.
Yeah, and you know, Catherine said all the right things. Let me add a couple of thoughts, because we have our own regulatory challenges with how we talk about functional ingredients and functionality of food and beverages to our consumers. So I think in that continuum that is being described here, and that I think I've disclosed already my bias given my career journey, should be only reinforced for all the good reasons that have been discussed so far. That continuum needs to be reinforced, needs to be catered to, needs to be curated more than it is right now. But I'll add a couple of things, because coming from high science and the pharma industry and moving into CPG and consumer-driven discussions, I've been humbled by a couple of things that I want to be put on excuse me, on the table. Number one is one of my biggest concerns when I was in the pharma industry trying to help with chronic metabolic diseases was adherence to use of medication. And when we talk about now helping with health span, that's a lifelong proposition. So how do you, even if you resolve all the other issues, science, regulatory, payers, you still have to think about how somebody's going to have to be taking these high-tech solutions their entire life. And I say that because I see the equivalent of it in consumer terms. Catherine was saying, you know, it looks like when you look at surveys and reports, etc., like everybody would like to eat healthier foods and foods that help with health and longevity to a certain extent. But one of the things to be learned from the food and beverage industry is that there is an immense say-do gap. And we, in the far front of that, don't even understand completely what are the barriers there from saying I want to eat healthier foods to then buying them. Because remember, when you go from prescription to selling to the marketplace, people vote with their wallet. There is no intermediary at that point. And so what is this large say-do gap is a big question mark in our space. The second thing is, even if I am, and I've already disclosed, a passionate supporter of the idea that a solution at scale includes food and beverages, there is still the issue that people buy food and beverages primarily for three reasons that have nothing to do with health: cost, taste, and convenience. And so the big challenge in our world is, and I'll be a little bit provocative here, is almost how do you hide health behind these three things so that it comes naturally. So that's why I really really have a smile on my face when a company like Mars Edge, which is known for selling candies, does serious things with science, because that's exactly, I think, the winning concept.
Yeah.
Is to go at science in a little bit more light-hearted way than we usually do. So I'll leave it at that. I mean, this is a little bit the other extreme of the edge of this conversation, but I thought it would be important to frame a couple of issues that we're facing on our side.
So, Ed, I couldn't agree more with what Catherine and Antonio said. I do think that this overlap involves the recognition of the importance of science, but involves the scientists thinking about terms that matter to people when they are the sole decider. The approach to disease modification largely implies that we have an informed decider that is for the most part different than the one who takes the product. And at best, those agents that we've developed get 60 to 65% adherence, as Antonio just said. So the thought that we're going to create a model where people see the utility in terms other than cost, taste, and convenience, I think it is really important that we address. The other thing about the food industry and nutrition space is, and maybe there's examples in the pharma space, but there are very few. There are a lot of participants in that space who could give a rat's fanny about whether or not what they are saying is backed by data. They simply will go right up to the edge, and when they're sued by the FTC, they'll flip over the words and say it again. So the space is cluttered with people who have zero trust with their consumers. And I've felt for a long time, people like Mars and PepsiCo and others who have a trust factor with consumers are the most logical candidates to participate in this overlap. And to that end, I was only going to say to Sebastian, it may be immaterial for recognizing agent at the regulatory level for the development of drugs, but it's not immaterial to get the same FDA agency to agree to different terminology for approving structure function improvements that actually have science behind it. We do need to move that regulatory needle there. I've tried to develop both a drug combination and a OTC combination for the same target area, and the agency is still an impediment. And I think we would be advised to acknowledge that at least in some space, the attitude about what we're talking about needs to be addressed at the regulatory agency.
What do you guys think about other regulators outside of the United States? I mean, FDA is kind of the gold standard, but they're slow to move and conservative by some estimates. And certain countries like Japan or Singapore are pretty open-minded about advanced therapies like cell therapy.
Yeah,
so if we could prove it working elsewhere, maybe the FDA would follow suit.
That's
Just can I be the bringer of some of the comments in from the audience, because I think that they may pertain. We're jumping around a bit, where I was going to get a little later into the regulatory stuff, but this is delightful. Let's do it this way. It's a great conversation. I think that the commentary, I sense it may be a little bit overly optimistic, but I don't think I'm qualified to make that judgment. One comment says, we've heard from many former FDA execs who are for the same, although it says former FDA execs, who offer the same consistent commentary on an anti-aging agent. bring us something with a good, safe profile, robust data, other patient-centric features, and we will be reasonable and even progressive in our thinking, okay? Reasonable and even progressive is a really interesting comment, right? The second comment, which is related, is that it says, I think that curing aging is in fact preventing age-related diseases. I believe FDA will eventually be interested in preventing. I think the effort should be in convincing FDA that preventing is less expensive than treating. As for now, funding agencies fund preventing, including NIH for basic translational research. So I just wanted to get those comments in because I thought they do relate to the regulatory discussion. Thanks. I don't know if anybody wanted to comment and don't want to take that, but it seemed like the right segue to bring in the regulatory perspective. So do we have an FDA? I noted, slightly sarcastically that the comment was that they hear from former FDAers. It would just love to understand, for those of you who have experience, and perhaps some of you on this panel do have experience intersecting with the FDA around discussions such as this. Do you share that optimism? Are we really making?
Can I jump? So I've had a lot of discussions with FDA, first again at Novartis, where we had a panel of every single head of every FDA division led by Janet Woodcock discussing how we would develop a drug targeting aging. And their recommendation was start with one aging-related disease, and they liked improving immune function to decrease respiratory tract infections. Then move to the next one, might be cardiovascular. Then move to the next one, might be sarcopenia. See if you have the same dose of the same drug that hits more than one of them. If you do, you could get a composite sort of aging endpoint, but they were very reasonable and enthusiastic. I don't think the FDA is really a problem. I mean, I think there's specifics like Joe might have hit. We got into a little bit of a bump when they were deciding whether we had to have a nasopharyngeal swab or not a nasopharyngeal swab to diagnose a viral respiratory tract infection. There are little bumps in the road, but in general, I think they're very amenable. If you show your benefit outweighs your risk, will approve your drug. So I haven't seen them, except for specific details, being a problem.
Everybody share that optimism, Morris?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one of the obvious things, and that is that at least the pharmaceutical industry has two servants, not just the FDA, but payers. And it sounds great to say that, well, we all know prevention is more cost effective than treating disease. But the reality is that payers determine cost effectiveness by event rate. And for many of the diseases we're talking about, the event rate is just too small, too modest in a preventive mode to make it really cost effective to reimburse drugs at the standard kind of rate that most drug prices are set. So I think in most situations these days, particularly for chronic disease, the criteria for approval are very different than the criteria for reimbursement. And the reality is we have to deal with both challenges.
Yeah, and Morris, I would comment that that's also the divide, I think, between the food nutrition side of it and the pharma side of it. And getting a good chance to get the pharma people back involved here a little bit. So to Kevin and to Stephen and to Morris, one of the issues, and again, and Kevin, I promise I won't ask you to comment on some of the Mounjaro, sales estimates that are out there, but they let's just say they are extraordinary, and and good for Lilly and good for patients, and I hope they are achieved. But we have a true sort of old Western style standoff here between payers and companies that are developing really safe and effective obesity drugs. This has changed now. The world's changed because now we know we have safe and effective ways to keep the weight off patients. We never had that before. I'm sure we had obesity drugs, but they all had significant baggage and significant issues. So having safe and effective drugs for managing patients' weight is a huge change. And I have seen incredible, and I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but, you know, and Kevin did mention it before, but one of the most interesting news items back in September was that, you know, Lilly actually got for this program from Modera, they got an expedited review from the FDA. They got breakthrough designation, right, or expedited review. And you know, to think back in the days when, you know, 10 years ago, we were developing fundamentally centrally mediated approaches to obesity that all had kinds of issues, that the FDA would fast track any of those things, you know, sort of blows me away. So clearly there's positive interest on the part of regulators. I think the issue is the one that Morris brought up, where it's the payers are sitting there, and that's the biggest difference between the food and nutrition panelists here and the ones that are coming from the biotech pharma side. It may be that there is, and this is a commercialization panel after all, that there are commercial paths for pharma that don't involve third-party reimbursement, but we don't have a lot of good historical analogs there, okay? Very, very few. So, you know, we are an industry in pharma and biopharma in which we expect somebody else to pay for the intervention. And right now, that request for payment is receiving simplification, but a rather rude no, okay? So maybe to come to the pharma representatives, what are your thoughts there around, and I know you're both not specifically working in the market access function, but just more broadly and generally about the progress we might make on the reimbursement front, as Morris raised that very provocative question.
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk first and I'll let Stephen talk. What we see with these agents that we're talking about, the GLP-1 and now, you know, Lilly, we've added GIP, and we're looking at a number of other agents that will potentially even improve on the agents we have. We're seeing improvements in a lot of comorbidities that are associated with obesity and with type 2 diabetes that are beneficial to payers. So we're seeing improvements in cardiovascular profile. If you look at the different, you know, LDL particles and HDL particles, et cetera, you see improvements there that we know from tirzepatide or from dulaglutide, and we know from semaglutide shows a cardiovascular advantage then, a decrease in MACE events. We see decreases in insulin resistance, some of them pretty profound, and we know that insulin resistance is tied into a number of diseases, including kidney disease. We are seeing improvements in kidney function with these agents. We're seeing improvements in liver fat deposition that we think will improve NASH outcomes. We're seeing maybe small, I'd say, improvements in neurodegeneration. So all of these agents have the ability potentially to improve health and thereby to keep patients from being hospitalized, keep them out of retirement homes. You know, this is the long-term future that we're hoping for, of course, is increasing health span. And I think some of these agents are maybe at the cusp of showing that.
Stephen, do you want to comment? And I actually would like to go to Mike.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, and you were talking about reimbursement and really greater access. I think one of the big things we've been championing over the last 2 or 3 years has been trying to get obesity recognized as a chronic disease. And that's been a major hurdle and is still a major hurdle in many countries. But I think that increasingly now at a global level, we are seeing countries recognizing that it is a chronic disease in its own right, not just a risk factor for other diseases. And I think that's important. I think the other thing we've noticed in the last probably 6 to 12 months, and I've mentioned this before, is that if you work in the space of in type 2 diabetes, for example, it's sometimes difficult pulling the patient back to clinic. And we talked about adherence and getting to stay on medication. The thing that we've noticed with obesity, now that we have the agents that we have, is patients now reaching out. You know, there's almost a queue at the door. And in some countries, and there's some products, you know, we can't make enough. And I think that the landscape has changed for 2 reasons. One, there is a recognition as a chronic disease. But 2, people want to lose weight. When they see medicines that can lose 15, 20% body weight, they latch onto that pretty quickly and they reach out for it. And that's been a big change and is quite different to the management of, say, type 2 diabetes.
Right, but right now, just to stay on that theme for 1 second, Stephen, the patients are going to reach out, and as long as you can make enough, you can supply the patients. But the underlying tension there is that the third party, that will be necessary for some of these programs to achieve some of the sales estimates that we've seen is probably going to be necessary. I probably dropped the qualifier. Unless we're envisioning self-pay markets that large. So, where are we? Unquestionably, the patient demand is going to be there. What progress are we making, or have we made on third-party reimbursement? I do think that's central, and I'll note that we don't have a payer representative on this panel, unfortunately. So, not actually picking on anybody for their domain expertise, and I certainly don't have any. But I think it's a really important, conversation to spend a couple of minutes on.
And I'll just kick off just briefly on that. I think it's different in different countries and different parts of the globe, or we're starting to see some differences emerging. Where people have got the money, they're not bothered, they're not struggling to dip into their pocket and pay for themselves, and that's really been quite startling. How the fact that people will pay for these treatments when they see that they work. But I think the other thing, and we've seen this in countries like my own, the UK, where pharma is working with governments to look at different reimbursement and funding models and ways in which you make medicines available through large, if you like, public health initiatives, where you have an agreement with the NHS or with government about not exclusivity, but making a medicine available. And we've seen this in lipid lowering. I think we might see it in obesity, where there's some form of contract agreement, and in turn you also you collect data. You're able to do primary prevention studies and collect data in that way. I think there's new ways of looking at healthcare that because we need to be, as pharma, we need to be part of the solution and not the problem when it comes to expensive new medicines.
Thanks, Stephen. There's a lot of hands
I
up.
think, Ed, we can look at erectile dysfunction as an opportunity for patient participation and pay to a significant degree. As late as 2019, federal law limited the inclusion of erectile dysfunction medication from Part D coverage, unless it was part of a treatment plan for another condition.
Yeah.
And yet a number of people willingly paid out of pocket a significant percentage, if not 100%. And
I want to come to Joan only because she has both her virtual and her actual hand up.
Sorry, Joan. I stepped on both your hands. Apologies.
No, we spent a lot of time talking to payers about a drug that would decrease the incidence or severity of respiratory tract infections, and would they pay for it? And what I didn't know until we had these conversations is that every flu season they shudder because healthcare costs just dramatically increase, because flu and other viral respiratory tract infections not only cause morbidity in themselves, but exacerbate underlying conditions, increase all-cause mortality. So they're expensive. So they were surprisingly positive about paying for a drug that would decrease the incidence or severity of these diseases, provided there were cost offsets, which were predicted. So, you need to have the cost of the drug not so high, but, under the cost offset. So you can actually save the healthcare system money if you can decrease expensive outcomes. So they were quite enthusiastic. So that was a nice message.
I'm sorry, but my age allows me to bring back historical, maybe irrelevancies, and I'll make one. When I was at Lilly, we were developing a drug called Evista to treat osteoporosis, and the beneficiary would be Medicare for those women who took it for 10 years and aged at 65. Asking the payers to pay for Evista to prevent a condition that would occur most likely 10 to 15 years later was not a trivial uphill exercise. And you almost have to frame this in the context of, because we don't have a single payer system, and God knows I'm not in favor of one because I've seen the sequela of those. That's where I see the opportunity somehow of figuring out a middle ground between the traditional disease payer structure, which permits higher reimbursement rates and funds the costly research necessary, and the consumers paying for things they buy every day. That middle ground seems to me to be the space, and I just don't know how to get there, but it is not a trivial exercise to get people to pay for a benefit that somebody else is going to enjoy.
More hands up, and I see the moderators can see the people. So Mark, I'll go Mark. I go to Mike, and I think Morris, you may have had your hand up. It looks like you took it down, but if you want to put it back up, we'll get you in there. So Mark, we'll go there first.
Absolutely. So I think in reference to the last discussion and in terms of prevention, I think we can learn a lot from what was done with the statins and Lipitor, right? So I mean, it's clear that we need biomarkers, we need outcome studies and biomarkers to predict aging, to predict health span, and these are probably going to have to be developed in kind of an open source way as well, by grouping together and people coming together to develop these, because this is no kind of trivial task either, and the quicker we do that, the better. But I think we can learn a lot from that kind of model. You need a predictive biomarker that tells you how you're preventing the progression of disease, right?
Yeah. I was just going to jump in with some comments on, how did the discussion with FDA go? Or sorry, how did discussion with payers go in terms of getting your drug on formulary? And so it's really a three-step process, right? So first is a purely science medical discussion with the P&T committee, pharmacy and therapeutics committee of the payer. Once they do their evaluation and decide that there's medical benefit, they'll also categorize like drugs that they bucket as being somewhat similar. Then you're kind of on formulary, but then the science piece moves out, and the second discussion is purely a commercial discussion, and it's two different groups, and it's purposely split that way. And that's pure economics-based discussion, meaning like these two drugs are similar. Who's going to give me a bigger rebate? And then that ultimately determines the copay and what's going to get on formulary. And the third piece is kind of what Joan was getting at. Is there's health outcomes research, right? So you have a whole division in pharma that's publishing papers and trying to look at cost savings to the system outside of the approved indication. So for example, we were talking about Kevin here with obesity, right? There's a bunch of additional benefits outside of obesity with that drug, right? So you would try to quantitate how much cost you pull out of the system and use that as a justification to your price, right? So if you want to ultimately be taking more cost out of the system, then the payers have to, lay out in cost to pay for the actual drug. And if you do that, that's a win for everybody. The tricky thing here is in a good best of world scenario, like say we extend the lifespan by even 10 years. Yes, for the approved indication, you're going to be pulling costs out of the system, but just like, flu season rolls around every year, someone was saying, right? And that adds costs to the system. You add 10 years of lifespan to the population. I mean, I can't even imagine what the cost is. It's probably a big number that runs off the Excel spreadsheet. So I think ultimately at the end of the day, when the rubber hits the road for the payers, they have to be positive on the P&L, and extending life is going to put tremendous pressure on them to do that. If not make it impossible unless we change the whole model.
I agree.
Mars?
Yeah, I was just going to follow that, and again, apologies this was covered, but just very specifically to the investor representatives here. And I think, Catherine and Antonio are listening to this, maybe either happy that they don't require third-party reimbursement, or maybe there is a situation in which medical food does get reimbursed. We have sold a lot of prescription strength omega-3s, right? For which reimbursement coverage does exist. So it's not like this can't happen. And it's not like if you do a study like Cosmos and the data do validate, you could make an argument. So I don't necessarily think we sit in a world in which payers who ultimately will acquire, even though in the bifurcated US system right now, there's so many combinations of commingled incentives, but where they will see the value of getting some of that health benefit, particularly Antonio, if they can, if they can get it, through something that's easy and tastes good and convenient, right? But I think for our purposes right now, they are kind of different worlds. So I just wanted to pose to and I'm handing off to the other moderators, but pose to Sebastian and to Mike and those from the investor side is how much of that discussion around the need for third-party reimbursement, is in your. We've already said you're not enormously worried about the FDA, if I heard you correctly. What about payers? As you look at early stage programs right now, do you think that just falls in line and we don't have to worry about it, or do you think we have to take a completely different path?
Well, I mean, I could just speak from the traditional biotech venture model. It's a huge problem, right? You're not going to attract capital if there's not a market for it at the end of the day that is being reimbursed. But there's other paths forward outside of traditional venture capital. So yes, maybe, but I think you'd have to structure your fund up front, and educate your LPs that this is the model we're pursuing. If it's going to be out-of-pocket cost or something like that, so that everyone is aligned and understands exactly what's the product at the end of the day. But I will say this, actually, I had a little flashback here at some point in my Pfizer career. And without naming any names who said this, it's no one in leadership today. This person is gone. But we were at a leadership meeting and someone was poking and asking provocative questions and just threw out, hey, what do we need FDA for? Can't we just, develop our products as supplements, basically, that don't have to go through FDA approval? So, I mean, it could be a path forward that way for aging-related products, and maybe through the what would you call it here? The what Antonio and Catherine here are from the what is it? Food and beverage industry.
Right.
Maybe that's the easier path forward. I don't know, but I do think, from going back to the investment side, if you were to kind of invest in companies that with that being the end goal, you would definitely need to align upfront, because it's a different model entirely from what biotech funds at least are being raised around today.
Maury, I'm going to turn over to Dennis in a minute, but Maury, I'm conscious that you had your hand up before and you put it down, and I want you to be able to comment on.
Yeah, there were a bunch of things went by that I was going to comment on, but I don't want to. I need the one. I guess it's good to be controversial, but I don't want to disagree too much. I mean, just a couple of points. One is I think somebody, Mark mentioned the fact that there are a lot of markers now, LDL, stuff that now we have good drugs to treat. But the world is different. I mean, the world right now is we don't get approval and we don't get reimbursement without demonstrating outcomes. And the PCSK9 antibodies is probably the best example of that in recent times. Right? The drug, it was a great drug, still is a great drug, and when the release failed miserably because, one, it didn't have outcomes initially, and two, it was priced too high. And every time you get something else which reduces a risk and it has to be given on top of something which already exists, the bar goes up higher and the size of the outcome study becomes larger. So it's very hard to, it's very hard to, cite success of future drugs based on past examples. I think Novi Stevens Cameron, Novo currently has an outcome study going on now for cardiovascular outcomes with anti-obesity, when treating an obese non-diabetic population. It's an incredibly important study. There's probably nobody I know in the field who doesn't believe that reducing obesity is going to reduce cardiovascular risk if you do a study large enough and with enough patients. But God, I hope their study's positive, because if it isn't, it's really gonna, it's gonna really throw a major major obstacle in terms of getting reimbursement for obesity and cardiovascular patients. Just a couple of other quick comments. I'll move on. I mean, when we looked at this, we found there's a $35 billion $35 billion budget now people spend on obesity treatment. So from the point of view of economics for pharmaceutical companies, the self-funded obesity, market is large enough to satisfy even the greediest pharmaceutical company. The problem is, from a health benefit, it's not going to treat a large proportion of people with obesity. So I think from an economic point of view, having obesity treatment self-funded is great. From a societal point of view, I don't think it's going to really address the needs. Lastly, just one other thing I just wanted to say, you've heard both from Kevin and Stephen about their company's commitment to metabolic disease and expanding the utility of some great drugs they have. I just, for the sake of people listening, I just have to point out that those two companies are the exceptions, not the rules. I mean, I have tremendous admiration and respect for them, and I think Novo and Lilly are doing exactly the right thing. But if you look across the pharmaceutical industry more broadly, most companies are getting out of these diseases. That's in traditional companies that have been committed to it. I mean, I don't want to mention a lot of, Merck, Janssen, these companies are not investing in metabolic disease, and they're very resistant to doing so. So I think it's great that we have on this conference, I think the two companies that deserve a lot of credit for their commitment to chronic metabolic disease. But I don't want to give the impression, I don't want anybody to walk away with the impression that reflects the industry as a whole. I think these are the exceptions that are doing the right thing. So I congratulate them, I thank them, but I wish there was more competition. And I say that as somebody who is very committed to developing these drugs, and Pfizer now has a modest portfolio in the same kind of drugs, not as extensive or successful as the other guys on, the other companies on the call. But most companies are out.
Morris, why do you think the other companies aren't pursuing this path? What's
money? I mean, it's money. I mean, the phase 3 studies are outrageously expensive now, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But the two biggest. It's interesting. Earlier, Sebastian talked about applying some of that we don't need an approval for longevity if we can take longevity mechanism and use them for common diseases. I don't think it's going to work for common diseases, because common disease is the hardest, most expensive diseases to develop drugs for, because the bar for safety. Look, the expense of developing a diabetes drug today in terms of approval is not showing it works. It's getting the safety database that the regulators require. Yes. And that's because it's a common disease. So common diseases are hard because they're expensive to develop from the point of view of safety. That's for the FDA. And they're expensive to develop from the point of view of the only way to get people to pay for them is by showing outcome results. And you have to do it on standard of care. So to show a cardiovascular benefit now, you've got to show it with a population that already has their cardiovascular risk reduced, because they're already on the great drugs that Lilly and Novo and some of the few other companies have. So, to get reimbursed, you need outcomes, and that's more and more expensive and requires now tens of thousands of patients and, multiple years. And you need safety, which requires, doing diabetes studies in multiple different populations for many times. So it's very expensive. And that's the reason it's, that's why, and the one other thing, and I promise now I'll shut up. Nobody yet has mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, I'd love to hear what.
I'm afraid to bring it up. Yeah.
But that's going to make it even more difficult.
No doubt.
Expensive.
Yeah.
To justify developing these drugs for diseases.
Especially if you're developing a small molecule. It may also paradoxically drive more interest on the food and nutrition side. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I say that to Antonio and Catherine, in particular. But I know that both Sebastian and Joan have had hands up for a long time. And then I'm going to hand it to my other moderators, because all I'm really doing is just picking on people who are asking questions. So this is really easy. But as a fair warning to Dennis and Joe, I'm going to ask both of them to sum up at the end. So or just jump in with anything you've got. So Sebastian, go to you, and then go to Joe.
Cheers. So yeah, Morris, you bring up a good point about the primacy of safety. In the longevity field, we hold drugs to a slightly higher safety standard because we give these drugs to mice for their whole lives. And so we can detect tox signal pretty readily there. And any drug that we want to give to a large population has to be much safer than the standard. One example of developing supplements in parallel to pharmaceuticals is a new molecule called astaxanthin that was just found by the ITP Interventions Testing Program, which is the gold standard for lifespan studies, to extend lifespan about 11%. This is not published yet. Astaxanthin, it is a carotenoid that makes flamingos pink and salmon pink, and it has these interesting anti-lipid peroxidation properties, but it's also been shown to activate FOXO3, which is one of the most important geroprotective genes. It's a transcription factor that regulates hundreds of pathway or different targets downstream in the hallmarks of aging. So there's a company that has actually been developing a supplement version of astaxanthin called Cardax. And astaxanthin has been in about 40 clinical trials. And in some of these trials, in cardiovascular biomarkers, it improves biomarkers better than anything that anyone's ever seen. And yet it's a supplement, so it hasn't been really advanced. But this company, led by their Amgen chemist, former Amgen chemist, has made analogs that is just a simple glycine conjugate, and they're advancing that into the clinic. And they have designing their clinical trials the former head of clinical at Amarin, which developed those very expensive turbocharged fish oil supplements that were mentioned previously. So I think there's a way to do this in parallel, where if you have a geroprotector that's super safe, develop it as a supplement, show that it works in the clinic, maybe with some small clinical trials, investigator-sponsored trials, and then follow up with a NCE for the larger markets. I also, while on the topic of the out-of-pocket payment for anti-obesity drugs, I'll take the opportunity to plug shamelessly one of the companies that we invested in early at HealthSpan Capital, Equator Therapeutics. They actually spoke at this conference last year, and they are developing a drug that is a mitochondrial uncoupler, if you've ever heard of this. Basically, your mitochondria are kind of like batteries. They store a charge in their inner mitochondrial membrane, and then they release that built-up proton gradient through ATP synthase, which turns this little flywheel and it makes ATP. If you build up too much charge in those batteries, you have an excess of ATP, your body turns it into fat. But there are drugs in existence that have been known for over a century that basically drain the battery and release that gradient. And one of them is called dinitrophenol, DNP, and it was developed by the Soviets during World War II and as an explosive. And the people working in the munitions factory realized, our body temperature is elevated and we're losing fat because they were breathing in the dust of this explosive. And then the Soviet military used it to keep warm in Russian winter. And this drug was later used widely by bodybuilders and housewives, and you would lose pounds of fat per week. But the therapeutic index was narrow, and so FDA banned it. It's still used a lot. And this molecule has kind of been revived recently by a company called Rivis Therapeutics that was just raised $123 million Series B, led by RA Capital and Medici. And they have basically made a liver-targeted version of dinitrophenol, and it causes, I think it was like 10 pounds of fat loss within 8 weeks or something like that, and it melts the fat off the liver, and it works really well acutely. But dinitrophenol, for the chemists among us, will realize that it is a well-known toxicophore. So this molecule is not something you would want to take chronically. And so the company Equator Therapeutics, led by Yuri Kyrichak, who is a professor at UCSF and a world leader in mitochondrial biophysics, has found this target called AAC that he published in Nature in 2019. When you activate that target, it causes mitochondrial uncoupling without the toxicity of DNP. And so they found a whole lot of different scaffolds that activate this target, increase respiratory rate, and seem to work in the mice. And so
let's talk on the VC side, Sebastian, talk about these companies generally, and Mike, maybe for you also, and Mark, for you also. When you start these small companies or you invest in these small companies, generally the way that you get your money back is selling them to Pepsi or Lilly or doing an IPO and getting liquid that way. Do you see this industry developing from a venture side where you can invest in these companies and ultimately partner with either the food industry or the pharma industry, or have a robust public offering market so that, in fact, limited partners such as the endowments and the like get interested in the sector?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's been done. There have been longevity companies that have IPO'd and have been acquired previously. There are many companies that position themselves as longevity companies, but they're not real longevity companies because they lack lifespan data, healthy lifespan extension. We're going to see that as the next, over the next 10 years, there's going to be a bubblicious period, and all of these carpetbaggers or clout chasers will come into the space claiming to be long bio companies, but they're not really. And so we came up with an objective list for what qualifies as a long bio company.
Mark, how do you see it? How do you see it with your company?
Yeah, so just building on what Sebastian was saying, I think the model that we have at Cambrian is this hub and spoke model, like BridgeBio, like Advance, where we have the stepping stone indications, which are near-term commercially viable indications, but also in parallel development of the same molecule or a backup or a series 2 molecule in longevity. So what this gives investors and potential partners is near-term revenue in a commercially viable indication, but also a long-term potential in longevity. So we see both investment from VCs, but also potentially partnering with the Pfizers of this world, not only for the near-term commercially viable indication, but also in the long term for longevity. So I think having this balance of both near-term revenue and commercial viability with the long-term investment gives a viable option in terms of continuing to get VC funding, as well as attracting, the Mercks and the Pfizers of this world as well.
Mike, how do you see it?
Yeah, you need the stepping stone indication. And I think the activity to date speaks for itself. So I have some more a cheat sheet here in front of me, and you could just read off. I mean, Sebastian mentioned RA Cap invested in one of these, right? And they're not going to do that unless they see, the traditional path that you were talking about, Dennis, IPO or sale, which has to be through the traditional kind of endpoints, not longevity necessarily, but that's the stepping stone, right? But here's a few more. I mean, a lot of these companies will be familiar to most of you. In silico medicine has F Prime, Kuiming, Humanosite, Access Industries is they're pretty active in our space. Gyroscope, Sophie-Nova, AbbVie, and Capsida, Section 32, I see here, in Cellularity. So, these are the investors that we invest with at Pfizer Ventures every day in traditional therapeutics, and they're dipping the toe here in the stepping stone model. I love that. I'm going to start using that. Yeah.
Maybe for the big pharma on the panel, Kevin, maybe kind of bring you in here. On the biotech, on the therapeutic side, big pharma talks about the importance of the venture community, and that's where most of the drugs are coming from now, and they rely on them. Do you think they're important in this sector? And then for Antonio and Catherine, do you guys care at all about venture, or are you going to do everything kind of internally?
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk first. We're absolutely interested in venture in small companies. We typically do collaborations or buy up companies depending on the situation and what they want to do on a pretty routine basis. I don't think I need to go any further than that. Probably it's just we're interested.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we leave this, we're going through a bunch of topics, and they're all interesting, and that's the problem. I also see, Joan, your hand up, and Sebastian, I don't know if it's a new hand or it was the hand from before. So I'll come to you in a minute, but Joan, before we go there, I just want to follow on some of Maury's comments before, and then cross over to the representatives from the non-FDA, non-safety FDA regulated side. So it seems to me right there, Maury was putting his finger on potentially might be a real advantage working, Antonio, from your perspective, and Catherine from your perspective, which is that, you're highly unlikely to be torpedoed by unanticipated safety issues. Not saying it couldn't happen, but, the nightmare of a pharma company working on these large chronic, indications, as Maury knows well, is not necessarily that you fail to show efficacy, is that you get an aberrant skin rash in phase 3 and the whole program stops, right? And the best news, it'll be on clinical hold for a long time, and the worst news is that the program is dead, Okay. So, and we know many examples of those, but if you cross into your side, you don't have that. So is that more of an advantage that you can leverage? Because I would say that the disadvantage you get, again, within the context of this tent of commercialization that we're talking about, is that you lack the same IP sort of protection that I think the pharma and the biopharma side almost takes for granted. So you want to just comment on that a little bit?
No, very briefly. I mean, you have to be careful with that concept because FDA, the F stands for food.
Right.
So
Yes.
it's not like we are unregulated.
No, not Antonio. Not to be clear, I'm not suggesting unregulated, but
no. But it is a very
right.
It is a very important point. You don't
Right.
lose a clinical trial and therefore a
Right.
clinical development program, but you run into a serious safety problem. You lose a product or a brand, and that can be as disastrous as anything else.
Right.
Also, the experience of a lot of us now dealing with this space of functional ingredients and functional foods, that's also highly watched by the FDA. I don't know that the FDA had the same aggressive stand as for the pharma company, but should I mention the whole space of CBD cannabidiol that has exploded in the marketplace, that's found the FDA unable to give a real answer on how to handle this potential ingredient, functional ingredient safely and effectively, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that there is lack of regulation. It comes in a very different form.
Yeah.
And safety and legality of what you put in the marketplace is paramount to building the trust that some of this company have with their consumers. Now, you have tried to get us into the discussion. Are we happy not to have a third party as the intermediary of what gets bought or not bought of our products? I would say absolutely yes. And I have all due respect for our colleagues in the payers field, although I was part of the debacle of anti-PCSK9 and their advent in the marketplace. So I have a few scars from that one, as well as early obesity drugs, should I mention Acomplia Simulti here. And so congratulations to Stephen and our colleagues at Lilly for flying the flag of those that thought that there was a marketplace for obesity after all. But I'll say something. I'll finish with this concept. The great opportunity with food and beverage is lifetime exposure. Okay, you have to think about the fact that people around the world, and I just came back from a visit to our research center in Mexico, so I could tell you the little story of the cookie that goes by the name of Maria's in Mexico, which has 90% market share, and it's consumed cradle to grave by a large number of Mexican people. That's the opportunity that you have. If you take that platform and you make it more permissible, in the specific case of this very humble but mighty cookie, we're trying to see how to reduce sodium content up to 35%, and you multiply that by lifetime exposure to this simple thing, then you can start calculating real impact, not only at the population level, but even at the individual level on blood pressure. And is that a way? So all of these large companies have been committed to making their even indulgent portfolios more permissible. So eliminating nutrients to limits, is that a way to contribute to this the solution to the problem? I really think it is, and that's why I'm passionate about supporting that effort across the industry, not only for our company, we are at the forefront, but the entire industry. I think that will ultimately have a very measurable impact on public health and specifically on living longer in good health, so health span.
And I'll just have a couple of builds. I think in the context of safety, in the food space, you have to get a certain level of approval for new ingredients. And so generally recognizable as safe is a pretty high bar, actually, because it has to be safe from basically cradle to grave. And so it is a different model than pharma in that sense, because of the access to that. And maybe the panel is less familiar, but sort of getting a new ingredient approval in the US or on the other side of the Atlantic in Europe, I would question today whether a conventional vitamin, if it hadn't had a sort of history of use, whether it would pass through these channels today. The bar that's expected in terms of safety for these food components is actually quite high because of their general use. And there's been heavy debate, particularly on the European side, whether there's been an issue around innovation and access that's been hampered by the process. The process has overcome the benefit, really. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. I think in a payer context, that's sort of two concepts. One is, depending on which health plan you might have access to, whether or not your supplement is even a reimbursable, accessible under the flexible spending account, can vary quite a bit. And so something as basic as saying a number of people in the US and abroad who have basic nutritional gaps, who want to be able to buy a supplement, wouldn't necessarily even be able to have that as a qualifying reimbursable expense, which seems quite bizarre. So it's not the same situation as a payer, but it's an element that does it does have an impact. And then I think the other is this: when is the world going to tip? I don't think we don't have any insurance companies on this call. At some point, disease treatment is going to overcome the costs of it's going to be too high. And so there's going to be this tipping point for prevention. It's going to be a must, not just a nice to have by some, but a must. And so, where is that, when is that pendulum, which we talk quite a bit about, when is that going to swing? Because we all look at these costs and we know both from a personal and from a societal perspective, the amount of GDP that goes towards healthcare and disease management is high. When, how do you switch the pendulum to sort of see the value and importance of putting that cost towards prevention? Because every year, you guys probably know better than I, in terms of every year that you put off having to get on a medication or a treatment, is not only quality of life, but sort of significant cost savings overall.
Yeah, and Catherine says something that reminds me to also make the point that in the scope of this conversation, we need to watch the space of food as medicine. So there are very interesting developments that have been a little bit endorsed at the federal level by the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition and Health that seem to be willing to push the idea of produce by prescription or medically tailored meals, or there are a number of experiments going on around the country. So that be the point of convergence that we have to observe going forward with this conversation. I think that might be a good place where to look at how this might evolve for the future.
So maybe I could jump in here. I also represent Mountain Group Capital, a venture firm, and we have made an intentional move toward covering animal health as an opportunity where we can participate in food as medicine for companion animals, especially. And I know this is a keen interest to Mars and to Nestle and to a number of other companies. And we're finding an enormous tolerance and willingness for pet owners to pay for quality products and food that gives them a chance to have a greater length of time with their friends, their companions. And I think there is a model for that. Without going through any reimbursing agents, there are prescription diets that are only available under the quote prescription of a vet, but they're not in a prescription controlled structure like the human medicines. And I think that is, and people are making these choices all the time. Do I buy the cheaper food or the more expensive food? And maybe there's a way, if we can involve the physician community in supporting therapies that are not necessarily the drug-only therapy, but those ideas where there are adequate base data that could treat a condition or help physicians care for patients. When I talk with my doctor, sometimes he says, I just don't know how to study the nutritional literature because it is so, it may have peer reviewed, but the peer review is a different standard. And therefore, I just don't read any of it because I don't know who to believe. So I think we have to find models that are working if we're going to crack through this. So that's my
I'm
observation.
conscious that Joan's hand has been up for so long that it might be getting tired if it wasn't fully virtual. So, Joan, do you want to bring you back? I know this was probably many points ago that you raised your hand, but on the sort of a moderator's, dilemma here. So.
Oh, no, I mean, it's been a great discussion. I wanted to, and it goes off what Catherine just said. I think it was Mike who mentioned if we extend lifespan by another 10 years, this is going to have a big impact on payers. But I think our goal is, of course, to extend healthy lifespan. That's the whole point, so that can have a tremendous decrease in payers' cost as long as if we can keep people alive longer, but without all of these morbidities. I mean, that's kind of the whole goal of what we're all doing. And then I wanted to bring in a fact that whenever we do placebo-controlled trials, there's an enormous placebo effect in people who are thinking they're getting something that's helping them prevent a disease or targeting aging. And so to do these placebo-controlled trials, as we've all discussed, it's really expensive and not necessarily feasible, except Catherine's an exception for supplements or food. So how can we be sure these supplements or food interventions are actually having benefit that isn't just placebo?
Catherine, do you want to comment on that simply in the context of the Cosmos trial? I mean, or maybe the way to say it is to say, is it necessary to do something like the Cosmos trial to address Joan's concern?
I mean, we were very fortunate to be able to do that, but let's just be very clear that cannot be the standard in the field, right? I was as the trial, the first publication came out in March. We were doing some sort of looking through documents. I mean, the first email exchange with the investigators at Harvard came in 2013. So that was a decade-long investment in not just financial, but from a people and resource perspective. And that's it's great to be on the other end of it, but man, it's not a journey we look to take again, right? And so I think what I want to say, I think from Cosmos, we want to reap as much benefit and understanding from that. We shouldn't view it ever as one trial. And how do we get more information? Sort of touching a little bit on some comments. Overall, nutrition trials, let's just face it, need to get better. Nutrition is a field. I'm trained in that space. I love it, but man, it's fraught with problems, right? And so, the idea of asking people what they ate and expecting a truthful answer, and it's not that they aim to deceive, but memories and other things. And so we still heavily rely in the nutrition field, particularly in epidemiology, on self-reported intakes and look to do a trajectory of health over a decade, right? It's just, we know that's not that may be the best that they think they can do, but we need to do better. So I think what I hope is sort of learning more from a sort of cross-industry, multidisciplinary approach. We need better biomarkers, both of food and nutrition and sort of nutritional status, better biomarkers that are accessible and sort of readily accessible and usable in trials. I'd love to see more surrogate biomarkers be advanced. It's great to have things such as blood pressure and blood lipids, but the field scientifically has advanced so much. We know there are a lot of other biomarkers related to cardiovascular health. Yet once again, back to our regulatory agency, their sort of portfolio of surrogates is very small. So really wanting to see, having really concrete conversations. There is a role of nutrition in health, full stop. We need to get better at these trials, invest more in making sure that we are asking sensible questions, and we have independent ways of validating both exposure and outcomes. And I think that's going to come from a sort of multidisciplinary cross-sector approach, because unfortunately nutrition hasn't been doing it really well on their own so far. I think they've gone as far as they can, but we need better tools to sort of strengthen the evidence and really be able to say, as Antonio was talking about, lowering sodium in food, and what the impact could be on blood pressure. It could be other components in foods, and overall, what's a healthy diet mix? We use these terms, but they're not really they're very subjective, and we need to get more concrete, more specific, once again, to give people actionable options for their health that span many different entities.
Great.
Well said.
Yeah, I'm getting some requests from the organizers through the chat here to bring in some of the questions, and I've been monitoring the questions to try to bring them in at a point at which they fit into the discussion. But that seems to be a futile effort. So I'm gonna allow some of these questions in. I think a lot of them, and thank you for them to everyone. I think they're more comments than they are questions. Some of them I will skip over, but there is one. I think I may have here it is, that I think might give me a chance to get Stephen, and in particular Kevin, back into this. But fair warning, it may put you on the spot a little bit. And it sounds a little specific, but I'll ask it. And it's that, is pharma working on beta cell islet transplantation or on artificial beta cells? Seems this research is slowly moving in academia. Do you think clinical trials could move faster if picked up by pharma? And then in sort of the conspiracy theory department, the comment is the insulin market is huge, so if concerns that these plans will be blocked. Do you want to assure the questioner that you have no intention to block those and discuss any commitment? I think I'll summarize that way.
Maybe I'll start on it. Lilly bought a company called Sigilon out of Boston several years ago, where we're working on beta cells. And of course, the issue with beta cell replacement is the immune system gets reactivated and attacks the new beta cells going in. And so I think everybody in the field is working on methods to prevent the beta cells from being attacked, and many different methods to do that. Which ones will work, we'll have to see, but certainly if we can get cellular therapy by putting beta cells back into type 1 diabetics, it would be an amazing thing, and it would be great. I think there's always worry about this, pharma's trying to block, or it's big money, it's big pharma. And, I hear that a lot. And I know many of you who've worked in the industry have too. I haven't ever met anybody in pharma who's trying to block anything. I think everyone that I've ever met in pharmaceuticals is really trying to improve patient health. And I think most of us, especially who are scientists, are not even cognizant of some of the marketing and stuff that goes on. We're 100% focused on trying to improve patient health. And so I'll kind of leave that at that.
I would also, before letting Stephen comment, I'd also comment, to be fair, that to the pharma side is that, and to Maury's comments about, and your dedication to metabolics and these challenging diseases. It just occurred to me rather ironically that, it's the more successful you are with drugs like Mounjaro and the other really effective interventions in weight loss, the less insulin you're going to sell. So I think that's going to be clear. All right. At the end of the day, but Stephen, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first of all, from a Novo Nordisk point of view, our mission statement is to cure diabetes, and that's not just words. We're making a massive investment into the development of cell-based therapy. And I don't worry for 1 second that if we were successful, I'm not worried at all about the impact it would have across the business. The most important thing for us is to make an impact on disease. What I can tell you is we've invested heavily in this area and continue to invest heavily in this area, and not just in type 1 diabetes, in terms of beta cells, and I have a big interest myself in islet cell transplantation, which I had before I joined industry. But we've got 4 big tracks that we're looking at, which I think is no secret, and it's type 1 diabetes, it's Parkinson's disease. We're looking at cell therapy also in terms of heart failure, and also in ophthalmology, so dry macular degeneration. So there's 4 key areas. We have a massive investment in this, and we would love to be successful. I think the reason you're not seeing more activity in type 1, and there are other companies working on type 1, as you know, it's a massive challenge in terms of how do you get those beta cells that come from cell-based therapy, and how do you protect them against the immune system? And we want to avoid immunosuppression. We're working on stealthing of the cells. Many people, others are doing this as well. But there are real challenges that we face every day. But we're fully committed to it. I can rest assured everyone we're fully committed to cell-based therapy. It's one of the big future ambitions for us. As I say, it's our mission statement to cure diabetes.
Thanks.
I don't know. We have just a little over 10 minutes, so we're probably going to get to Hook pretty soon. But I was wondering if maybe we could each take in a minute or less the takeaway from today, or anything you learned today that we should take home. Mike, would you take a first crack? Did you learn anything?
Yeah, but I'm the new guy here, so what I learned is probably might be known by many of you already. But it just reinforced that this the path forward in the near term is the stepping stone approach that companies like Cambrian are taking, and also I think there's a lot of good substrate out there for investment that Sebastian gave us a few good nice examples. And in the long term, we'll have to figure out how to pay for this. But if you can show benefit, we'll figure it out.
Got it. Kevin, you want to take a shot?
Sure. I'm impressed with the amount of investment and the amount of interest from both the drug side and also the food side for longevity. And this is an area I think we've always seen as the Holy Grail. It shows that there's so much interest now. It shows that we may have some pathways forward. And I think that the future's bright for this area.
Sebastian?
Right. So one of the parting messages I want to convey, you guys all are familiar with Eroom's law, the term Eroom's law. So it's the exponentially rising costs to get a new drug approved, declining internal R&D productivity. Thankfully, this doesn't apply to biotech R&D, as shown by Andrew Lowe's work. But the guy who coined the term Eroom's law is named Jack Scannell. He's actually a friend of mine. He published this in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery in 2012. And he just came out with a paper a couple of weeks ago in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery, in which he argues that the major driver behind Eroom's law is that the animal models of disease are not realistic or reliable. They do not recapitulate the human disease, right? So we all know this. Alzheimer's is a good example. You express 4 times the normal amount of amyloid beta, and you call that Alzheimer's, and you clear A beta, and it treats the disease, but it doesn't treat real Alzheimer's.
So is the take home that animal models don't work in this sector? Is that the take home?
Well, the beauty of the longevity field, the geroscience field, is that we rely less on contrived animal models of disease. I mean, we still have to check that box ultimately, but if you have a drug that extends healthy lifespan across species that are hundreds of millions of years evolutionarily distinct, yeast, worms, flies, mice, and it extends the healthy lifespan of mice, even when you give it to them for their whole lives, and it works in multiple different animal models of disease, contrived as they may be, that drug is much more likely to work in humans. So there are all these perverse incentives that cause us to continue to rely on these unrealistic animal models of disease, and maybe testing drugs in wild type lifespan studies gives us some sort of partial solution.
Catherine, you have a take home? Thanks, Sebastian.
I think for me, these type of meetings continue to reaffirm the need for always taking not only a multidisciplinary approach, but involving different sectors, because I think there's so much that can be learned. Some of the idea of certain things are barriers for some, not for others, but jointly, how can the science and the research that's being done elevate both? And so I think these are great opportunities for us to sort of share and learn from each other. But then the next step, I think, is how do we action this and take this forward?
Antonio, you have any takeaways?
Yeah, it's very much along the same lines. It's a big issue, lifetime exposure to any solution. It has to be at scale if we want to make an impact. And as I said, it has to be low tech, low cost, or it will scratch the surface of the problem. So I think ultimately this might seem a little bit banal, but my take home is reinforcing the concept that this is only going to be solved, or we're going to start seeing a potential solution in the context of large collaborations, perhaps even unusual collaboration and partnerships.
Mhm.
So I hope that as we move forward this conversation, we continue to explore that interface perhaps a little bit more aggressively. What are these collaborations? How can they be formed? Who should be part of it? How do they move the problem forward? Nobody individual is going to be able to solve it.
And when you talk about scale and low cost, do you think food and nutrition is going to lead the way versus pharma in the longevity field?
No, I think we'll do our part. I think we are doing our part. The question is, how do we cross-pollinate? What does that concept mean for other fields? And vice versa for us. What is this concept of food as medicine? How is it going to develop? What is it going to mean for large corporations?
Joan?
I think one of the most exciting topics that we've heard about is the GLP-1 receptor agonists targeting multiple diseases. And it's sort of on its own, independent of whether it's a life, aging biology, it's doing in the real world, sort of extending healthy lifespan, even if it's for a subset of the older adult population. It's really exciting and kind of paving the way.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah, so I would just say when we're talking about trying to extend the healthy lifespan, what we're trying to do is avoid the long-term, we're trying to avoid chronic disease. These have a massive impact on individuals and they have a massive impact on society, and I know we all know that. And I think, we've said, although in many respects we've sort of been leading the way in obesity, that we welcome other players in this space. I don't think there's anyone on this screen that I'm looking at who I would see as competition. Of course, we talk about competition, but I think the way that we crack this is by working together in a collaborative way. And this is such a common problem, obesity, for example, and all of the diseases associated with it, which I believe feeds into that healthy lifespan. There's so much around that there's enough for all of us to get our hands wet, to get our hands involved. So it's going to require a lot of effort, a lot of collaboration, but there's plenty to go around for all of us. We need to work together.
Mark?
Yeah, thanks. I'm less concerned about the investment in this area. I think in any new frontier, it's always a new challenge. I wonder if the GLPs and the mTORs of this world are going to be like the anti-TNFs, right? Where ultimately you're going to be able to go in, multiple indications and treat multimorbidity diseases. So I'm very hopeful, but I also need, going back to some of the early discussion, also we need some outcome biomarker studies to help us along the way. There's no question about that.
Maury?
Yeah, thanks. I really, my major point is very much like the one that other people have said, and that is pretty clear from this conversation that there are a lot of different perspectives and experiences out there. And we can there's a tremendous value in talking more and working more closely together than we do just in conferences. But two points in particular. One, if we're going to do that, we have to be very specific about language, because our different backgrounds really have different connotations of these words for different. If we're really going to communicate well, we've got to be very specific about how we do it. We have to listen to each other and profit by each other's experience. Then lastly, this is all going to be based on good, hard quality science, and there's still a real need for more funding and more evidence reproducibility in the basic science that all of this stuff is being based on. So I just always worry about getting too translational too quickly and not really remembering that it's going to come out of good hard science.
Got it. Ed or Joe, you have anything you want to?
My only comment is I think this just really emphasizes the importance of collaborations, as Antonio said, and the overlap between food and pharma. I'm trying to imagine the definitional space that exists in between the two. And Maury, I think you're exactly right. Maybe we start with what do we mean when we say efficacy and safety? And what do we mean when we say clinical proof? And maybe we begin to populate those critical words that could establish the foundation that we could approach payers, regulators, the marketplace, and so forth to say, well, these are the quality standards, or these are the standards that can help us collaborate. I'm also encouraged about the tone that we hear from the VC community. I think money is going to be available. I think, who made that comment? Mark. I believe it is. Yeah. But I'd like to see us enlarge the space definition to include that middle ground. So I come away from this more hopeful than not, but a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I don't, I more or less agree with what Joe just took from it. So in the interest of time, I won't go into any big details, but I would focus on the fact that, for the one thing is that we do need this ecosystem. We need biotech. We need the innovative core. We need pharma. We need pharma's ability to marshal science into clinical data and take it through regulators. We need payers to be involved. One of the comments I didn't get to raise before that came in the chat is that we need to be careful because a lot of people, I'm paraphrasing the comment, with the worst health outcomes aren't able to afford these interventions. So that self-pay isn't even an option for them. And those are the people that are driving the greatest cost in the system. There's very little doubt about that. So very heads up comment, sorry I couldn't bring it in earlier. But yeah, I mean, I more or less agree that, so where I started, we can probably close, which is, it's 5 years since the first conference. The science has come a long way. The pathways are starting to be clear. It's always hard to bring in, to Maury's point, it's very hard to bring in these really different stakeholders that are in different silos. I think we did a pretty decent job of doing it today. Hope you all agree. And I think we need a lot more of these conversations. So with that, I'll close it and hand it back to the moderators for Thomas.
Wow, thank you so much. This was epic. It was, I'd call it historic. I think Joe, Dennis, and Ed were a little bit concerned how to fill the time. I think it's obvious that there's a lot of topics that could be covered. We could keep this conversation going. I hope we do. I just want to thank everybody so much. We are now headed for a break, but I'm going to throw the mic over to Zan, who's just joined the conference desk.
Well, I just want to say we have been checking with the Guinness World Book of Records on the longest session in a scientific or any conference or conference of any kind. I think we've got it, 2 hours, 15 minutes. It's epic. And it's not just quantity, it was quality. I mean, the sound bites and the insights were just coming right and left. I can't believe the articulation. There is so many epiphany moments for me, and I know for the audience. So, gosh, I'm just on the floor after watching this high wire act. I didn't think it could be pulled off. And great bladder control. I don't see any of you squirming.
Some of us took a break.
Stephen Goff, you look fresh over in Copenhagen at very late at night. So bravo. I just can't thank you enough for this amazing session. This will go viral. It's one of the most important sessions we've ever had in the Metabesity conference. Can't thank you enough.